This is an extract from the Leader Coronavirus Daily podcast by the Evening Standard and hosted by me, David Marsland. To hear the whole thing, search for it on your podcast provider. The Health Secretary Matt Hancock's written exclusively in the Evening Standard about how he wants to get London and the country moving again as quickly and safely as we can. He's announced £300 million is going to local authorities to expand track and trace work and warned from June 1st, even those showing no symptoms of coronavirus must do their bit by self-isolating if they're told they've come in contact with someone who has the infection. The newspaper understands the government's looking at potential fines and spot checks at home to make sure people are complying. Elsewhere, fines of up to £1,000 will be forced on people who leave the country to go on holiday and don't quarantine for 14 days. But there are lots of exceptions, and it's come quite late into the lockdown. Our editorial column says the plans are unworkable.
Just as infection rates start to fall in many parts of the world, the government is finally announcing plans to bring in compulsory quarantine. Either arriving travellers are dangerous, in which case we should have been protecting ourselves from them since early March, or they are not, in which case this policy is shown for what it actually is, a bit of silly tokenism designed to make ministers look tough. The plan has been shot full of holes before it has even started. Lorry drivers will be exempt, which you can understand, but why fruit pickers and perhaps racing car drivers too? Nor is there a plan to enforce the rules. The police say they won't. This isn't going to work, so we need a better plan. The government could start by agreeing restriction-free routes to those European countries that have brought coronavirus under control, if they are prepared to take passengers from Britain. That way we could go on holiday this summer, save our airlines from bankruptcy, and stay safe.
Our Associate Editor Julian Glover joins me now. Julian, we've been in lockdown for a while now. Why haven't we also had quarantine rules?
In fact, until early March the 13th, there were rules that said if you come from a highly infected location, you ought to self-isolate, not just wander around. Do you remember, right at the beginning of all of this, we used to see those scenes of British travellers from abroad flying into RAF bases and being driven on coaches to special quarantine centres where they had to eat terrible food for 2 weeks before they were released into the streets. Then we all gave up on that, and at the moment, if you fly into Heathrow or Gatwick, if you can find a plane to take you in, you go through immigration, you're told maybe wear a mask, not made to, told probably don't use public transport, but you're not made to, and you just wander off into the country. That's going to go on for a couple more weeks. We're about to get quarantined.
We are, but the Evening Standard's calling it a silly tokenism version of quarantine. What's wrong with it?
Well, a lot of people are saying, and they're right, that it's first of all too late. We should have done it sooner. People coming in are often coming in now from countries that have less coronavirus than us. They're not the threat, we are. So it's too late, a bit like the thick of it. The government's finally caught up with where it should have been a couple of months ago. And second, quarantine rules for everyone just aren't going to work. If all people arriving, as airlines increase the number of flights a little bit, we're still getting 1,000 people a day so through Heathrow, for instance, trying to make them all quarantine at home without any structure as to how they're supposed to do it, without any way of checking if they're following the rules. The police say they won't. Cressida Dick, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, says it's not her job to go around checking if people are staying at home. There was talk inside government of Border Force doing it, the organisation that checks passports at immigration. We can barely do that accurately or check how many people are in the country, let alone drive around seeing if people have locked down, as the rules say they should. Michael O'Leary, who runs Ryanair, says the rules would be absurd, nobody's going to follow them. That's probably true. So instead of that, we probably ought to be finding out who's actually a threat, because they've come from a country that has a high risk of infection at the moment. Maybe someone who flies in from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where infection rates are going up and the government's really trying not to control it very much. They ought to be asked to quarantine. We ought to focus on them, perhaps use things like the app, if that ever starts happening, to make sure they aren't going out and breaking the rules. And then other people who've come from places where the infection rate is low, somewhere like Denmark, somewhere like Greece, perhaps, which wants holidaymakers, maybe Spain soon as it recovers, Italy as it opens for tourism, at least large parts of Italy, should be able to come in without quarantine. So we actually have an intelligent kind of quarantine, not a blanket rule. Government likes a blanket rule because it sounds tough. and it's easy to announce, it's very hard to enforce.
Yeah, is this where something like air bridges, which we've talked about on the podcast before, could fit in?
Getting what are called air bridges, these links to key countries that might allow tourists in without quarantine and allow them back into Britain without quarantine, is actually quite difficult because it involves the government negotiating with other European countries. It's not very good at that at the moment. It involves the government making choices, always difficult. They'll be unpopular. What if it said Greece was okay and Spain wasn't? And one final thing, it involves the government admitting that coronavirus here has been worse than lots of other places. So it isn't that healthy Britain is trying to quarantine itself from the world, as the message seems to be. It's that the world, which is increasingly healthy, may want to quarantine itself from Britain, at least until we can get infections and deaths right down. So it would be scary to say we want an air bridge with Greece and find that Greece didn't want us. It would be embarrassing to try to do an air bridge with Malaga or Alicante and find that they're welcoming in Germans, but not Brits. So perhaps for now it's easier for the government just to have a quarantine for everybody, to hide from the fact that maybe we won't be able to travel very much until we get infection rates right down, and we're not doing that as fast as some of our European rivals are. Whatever the thinking behind it, 3 months late, a blanket quarantine announcement coming in June is completely ridiculous, and it won't last very long.
Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.